Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to meet you and to reflect on the influences that I have had over the years, which have shaped my work in the field of ecological economics. When I think about it now, I believe it was my school teacher when I was in secondary school, my geography teacher, Mr. Vishwanathan, who aroused my interest in nature. He taught geography as an analytical subject, and my memory is very strong in that. He presented the landscape in a very colorful way. He made you want to take interest in the landscape around you. However, the obvious thing would have been for me to do geography in college, in university. But in those days, if you were reasonably clever or doing well in exams, you'd have to do physics. That was the that was the social norm. So I did physics and then mathematics here in Cambridge, and then moved to economics. So my interest in geography and the biosphere lay dormant. Nobody in economics was working in this field of ecological economics, at least not in the late 60s, which is when I did my PhD. But somehow there was one aspect of it which did come out in my PhD thesis of 1968. The question I asked there was, what is the optimum size of the human population in a world which can produce capital, roads, buildings, machines, but is constrained by a fixed factor, land I had in mind. And I showed that the answer becomes very different when you have a fixed factor. The economy becomes bounded. But then it stayed there. I didn't really work on that. I worked on other fields like game theory, industrial organization theory, and so forth. But over the years, my interest in nature was sort of simmering away, if you like, until about 1991 or so. I was asked by my friend, the late Carl-Johan Mailer, who had just become director of the Bear Institute for Ecological Economics in Stockholm. He asked me to be the chairman of the scientific board. Now, the reason he asked me was that I had been working over the previous 10 years or so in the 80s in trying to understand deep poverty in South Asia, in India, Bangladesh, Pakistan, real deep poverty in South Asia, in terms of ecological resources or lack of ecological resources. Now, when I look back on it, I have to say, I think I was exactly on the right path. Because poverty studies, and there was lots of work on poverty, deep poverty, that's called development economics. One thing was absent in these studies, nature. And that's really odd, because the poorest people live on nature, literally live on nature. The poorest you can think of would be indigenous populations in Amazon. Well, 100% of their product, the things that they take, are from the neighborhood, from their forest region. So it's very odd that nature was absent in development economics and the economics of poverty. Of course, it was also absent in growth and development economics. Nature wasn't there. It was capital accumulation, growth, GDP growth, scientific knowledge, human capital formation, produced capital formation, but nothing about the fact that there is a biosphere, which could be tarnished, could be destroyed even as you grew, okay? I found that odd, and I then realized, of course, one of the reasons this was happening was that the key index that was used that have been used and continues to be used for economic success is GDP. And GDP is an acronym for gross domestic product. Now remember, it's gross, not net. So it doesn't take into account the depreciation of capital assets. And then it occurred to me, of course, that nature is a capital asset. That's one way of looking at it. All the ecosystems, they're capital assets. Grasslands, wetlands, coral reefs, forests, you name it. These are capital assets. Complex, no doubt, but they are capital assets. They are assets. And they're churning out services and goods which we, as humans, make use of. These ideas were going through my mind, and I was trying to understand deep poverty through the lens of the local environment. Now, I have to say, I wasn't the only one doing this. Anthropologists had been doing this. And ecologists, some ecologists had been also trying to understand it, but they didn't know economics. What I'm complaining about, or what I'm suggesting was missing, was economics being engaged in this kind of work. Let's call it ecological economics. So when I was asked by Professor Mailer to be chairman of the board of the Bear Institute of Ecological Economics in Stockholm, it was re-established in 1991, that was when I started meeting ecologists, because the board of the institute had equal numbers of economists and ecologists because it's Institute for Ecological Economics. And because it's in Stockholm, with the Royal Swedish Academy of Science backing it, the board was with really high-powered people. There was people like Kenneth Arrow, Robert Solow in economics, and in ecology, Paul Ehrlich, Simon Levin, and many others. So we used to meet regularly at the board meetings, and then subsequently after each board meeting, we used to meet together for 2 days of discussion. So this was the first time, I think, ecologists and economists got together in a consistent, systematic way to define new problems and then look for solutions. I think this was the first time that ecologists and economists actually met and did not shout at each other. Because in the previous years, the history is of ecologists being extremely suspicious of economists, rightly. Because they would say, look, your models don't have anything about the biosphere, and that's what we study. And the economists would say, well, that's a minor aspect of life. So, there are very distinguished economists who used to say, well, our national accounts show that nature is probably 5% of GDP. So big deal. I promise you, I'm not making this up. There were writers who dismissed the concerns of ecologists by saying that national accounts don't display our essential need for nature, because it's human capital, produced capital, and ideas. So technological progress. Okay? Now, the problem was that they were underpricing nature in these exercises. Now, if you say that nature has zero value, then of course it won't show up at all, anywhere in the US national statistics. And people will also treat it as though it's of no value. And so therefore they will mine it more and more as we have. So in a way, I began to see that it was the fact that nature's value was not reflected in the market, in market economies, and was not appreciated by the state in authoritarian economies like the Soviet Union. I'm not talking about before 1990, that nature was not taken seriously in economic models, either in the West or in the Soviet Union and the in Eastern Europe. Okay. And so I started working with ecologists in 1991 very seriously. Now, I should mention, there's one thing I'm still very, very proud of. In 1982, I published a book called The Control of Resources. And in many ways, it's an unsatisfactory book because it's short chapters on essentially ecosystems like forests, grazing lands, and so forth. And each chapter talks about a particular resource and then shows what problems there may be in its use. Now, this is 1982, so there was very little empirical work I could cite. And then I also had in the book, because of my interest in population, I mentioned the work that I had done in my PhD thesis, I also had chapters on demography, optimum population. So the idea is to look at, I ask questions like, what should the size of the global population be if you want to maintain a certain standard of living, given that the world is finite? So there's some kind of a trade-off between numbers and standard of living. Now, that question was seen to be a wrong one by most of my economics friends, because they felt that technological progress will make this trade-off less and less relevant. Okay, you can have more food, more goods, and more people because you'll be more efficient in producing the stuff. And that belief continues even now. If you read the Economist newspaper, weekly newspaper, The Economist, underlying it is the idea that we are so clever, we can overcome these resource scarcities. Okay, I wasn't buying it. I didn't believe that to be the case. But I didn't know how to show that. And in some sense, my control of resources was the blueprint for all the work I've done in the last 30 years, culminating in the review I produced for the UK Treasury, the Economics of Biodiversity. It really is built on that 1982 book, even though in 1982, I couldn't have written this review at all. I mean, nowhere near. But it was like a reconnaissance exercise, that book. I was grappling with certain problems which I did not fully understand. I didn't certainly know how to tie them up into a picture. And that I've been able to do, at least to my satisfaction, in my review. But this review is produced in 2021, and I'm talking about a book which was written in 1982. So we're looking at a 40-year time spell. Now, the Bayer Institute was an exceptionally fertile ground for ecologists to speak with economists and vice versa. And the annual meetings there and the way Karl-Göran Mailer and I ran the Institute's scientific program enabled this area of ecological economics to flourish. Remember, it wasn't because only of Karl-Göran and me. We were the midwives. The real heavyweights were the Arrow and Levin, and they brought, and Ehrlich, and they brought their intellectual stature to help us attract younger and younger people to build the subject of ecological economics. And I think that has been a great success because two disciplines got together, which they hadn't before. Interesting, I can give you an example. In 1989, I joined Stanford University as professor. Now, the great Kenneth Arrow was professor of economics there. And Paul Ehrlich, a giant in ecology and population ecology, was professor at the same university at Stanford in the ecology department. All right? They haven't met. They've been there since the late 50s because of the suspicion between these subjects. When I got to know Ehrlich, I invited Arrow and Ehrlich to lunch with me in the faculty club. That's the first time they started interacting. And of course, they became very good friends eventually through the Bayer Institute. So reason I'm mentioning this and emphasizing it is that its scientific progress depends heck of a lot on personal relationships. We forget that. It's not a cold venture that, you sit in your, you work in your lab if you're a applied scientist, or sit at your desk. Interaction is extremely important, and personal relationships matter. People like each other, which Arrow and Ehrlich began to see, they became very good friends. Then a subject can get a sort of momentum, because younger people who are interested in interesting problems, they're interested in interesting problems because they want a PhD or want to write a paper, let's build a career. They need to be attracted to problems which are set by people they admire. If they feel that people they admire, great names like Arrow and Ehrlich and others, who are approving of a particular line of research, then the young person won't feel embarrassed about working on it and be shy. Because otherwise, how do I know, he might say, whether my work will be seen as relevant by others? And I think that's a very important role that senior scholars, scientists can play, and they do play that. I had one advantage. I became a professor of economics quite early in my life. And because not my work in ecological economics, but my work on game theory, industrial organization, more straightforward, down mainstream economics. So in some sense, my work on ecological economics was humming away in parallel with my mainstream work. So the recognition I received from my colleagues was from my mainstream work in the 80s, 90s, not for ecological economics. It was because of my work on game theory, industrial organization, population ethics, that class of issues. But I was churning away with this puzzle, was linking poverty, deep poverty, with the ecology, and there I was right. I used the work of anthropologists to show how the economic, how one might model the dilemmas of poor households in dry lands of Africa or erratic rainfall, how they might cope with it, and to model a household activity. Now, in a way that, to me, I still feel that was the best work I've ever done, because it hasn't been really recognized much, by the way, because people who work on poverty haven't read it. And those who are ecological economists, they're not so much interested in poverty. That's a very specific problem. They're worried about more general problems of deforestation or disappearance of coral reefs and so forth. And that's understandable. But I still feel that that work is the one that I feel most close to, because it was a deep problem. We are looking at 1 billion people at least, really poor people in South Asia and bits of Latin America, who are living in, and take farmers, small farmers in South Asia, at one extreme, and the other extreme you have indigenous populations in the Amazon forest, who might be just chucked out because miners come to dig for gold, and then they lose their home and their land, everything gets destroyed. So there is a huge human problem attached to the workings of the human economy in the biosphere. And it's that human problem that I kept on being attracted to understand. Anthropologists used to talked a bit, but I wanted to understand the economic mechanism by which that. So a good deal of my work started in that vein. And then, of course, through the Bear Institute, I became more and more interested in ecology as a subject, because I learned from them. We used to go for long walks with, say, Paul Ehrlich or Simon Levin, 2-hour long walks in which I would explain economics to them because they were very suspicious of economics. And they would explain ecology to me because I was ignorant of ecology. So that was fantastic. I really learned a lot. And then what was I trying to do? What I was trying to do was to reconstruct mainstream economics by embedding the economic model in the biosphere, in a model of the biosphere, so that the biosphere would not be an add-on. It would be essential, that the human economy is embedded in nature. That was the idea. Now that's very different from the way the economics of climate change was being developed. That was the one field in economics which took nature seriously. Climate. Okay. So how did they do it? Well, here's how they did it. They took the standard model of economics, growth and development economics, which has no biosphere in it, okay? Just human capital and produced capital and ideas. That's it. Okay, these are the factors which are propelling an economy and going for growth, GDP growth, okay? And then onto that, the climate economists would add a climate sector. All right, now what does that mean? It means that what they will say is there is a byproduct to output, call it carbon dioxide. And if that, let's say it's proportional to output, just for the sake of argument, then as carbon dioxide is emitted, the usual story now, we are all familiar with it, it resides in the atmosphere, and the carbon cycle is disrupted because more carbon is pumped into the atmosphere through economic activity than nature can absorb, recycle, okay? So it gets accumulated, leading to the warming pattern of the greenhouse warming. The warming, in turn, feeds back, creating problems for output, okay? So you have a loop now. You go for growth, but it rebounds on the economy by reducing growth possibilities because of the warming. Say agricultural output is affected and so on. Okay, so that's the story. But now here's the trick. What you want to do is to find substitutes for carbon, for fossil fuels. What you want to do, you want to still go for growth of GDP, but you do that using clean energy. So that sort of gave you a big, beautiful picture. You substitute your way out of trouble. And trouble means not having enough, not having growth of GDP. They never asked, is GDP the right thing to go for? They're not asking that. They're simply asking, we want GDP growth, 2%, let's say. How do we get it? By substituting away from fossil fuels. So that was the story. And the models were what the recommendations were, if about 2 to 3% of global GDP is invested in clean energy, then you will be able to continue to have growth, but you will move away from dirty energy, and all will be well. Now, the problem with this entire apparatus, which I realized, I think about 20 years ago, through the Bayer Institute discussing, is that climate is only one of the services. Climate regulation is only one of the services that the biosphere offers us. The biosphere also offers us many other services. Soil regeneration is one. The standard one is a soil regeneration. Nitrogen fixation. There is just a huge number of other services that complement climate regulation. By climate regulation, I mean keeping the climate more or less stable, which we have enjoyed for the last 12,000 years or so, and that has enabled the whole of the civilization that we enjoy, we see, are experiencing, or being part of, is only about 12,000 years at best, since the agricultural revolution, the end of the Ice Age, as it were. So this understanding that I had, and it's not due to me, I was taught this by my ecology friends, and I spent a lot of time with them, and I know ecology quite well now, because of them, nothing else, made me realize that we really have to think of the human economy as embedded in Mother Nature, namely the biosphere. And that the biosphere is a very complex, dynamical system, producing a huge range of services which are complementary to one another. By complementary, I mean that if you destroy one of the services, one of the processes, the others also get destroyed or weakened. They're not substitutable. You can't say, oh, let's have less, we can substitute for climate soil regeneration. So if you want to stabilize climate, let's get rid of some of the soil or workings of the soil. If there are substitutes, you could do that. The problem is, if you do that, then you won't have food. And you have many other things that the soil does for you. All the fungi and so forth, okay? I mean, decomposition of waste is a huge service that Mother Nature offers. Organisms die, they get recycled. If they didn't get recycled, you just have dead organisms everywhere, okay? So all these services are complementary to one another. And so my entire picture of the global economy was built on complements, not substitutes. Of course, there are substitutes, but they can only operate so long as these complements are not disturbed too badly. And I began to think of building the human economy along those lines. Okay. And my review reflects that. The review of the economics of biodiversity was built on that understanding. So that's one number. The second aspect of this work, and that I came to it much later. It was only in a published paper in the Proceedings of the US National Academy of Science of 2020, in fact, that it found its mark. What I did was to ask, so Mother Nature offers these goods and services, and we are using them. And we know that we are demanding too much of it. Otherwise, we would not be talking about ecology, right? Climate change is one thing, biodiversity loss is another, and so many other things. So the demand we make exceeds the nature's ability to meet that demand on a sustainable basis. Now look how I've converted the problem into an economics one, demand and supply. Okay? The key words that we use in economics are now brought in. But what is it we are demanding? Demanding nature's goods and services. And then what is nature supplying? Her goods and services. And if we take more out of nature than she can replenish, then we're reducing her capacity. So the picture would be like a fishery. The fishery is a natural regenerative process. And if you catch fish at a higher rate than they can reproduce, then the stock is going to decline. And at the end, it will be destroyed. This is happening in the Mediterranean, and the cod fishery of Atlantic cod fisheries are also happening. We're taking more out, so the fishery gets depressed. It becomes costlier and costlier to find fish, okay, with the stock is. So you use that kind of a picture to see that might be happening to nature. So in the 2020 paper in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Science, that's the model that I tried to say, that what's at heart, what we're taking away from nature exceeds what she can replenish. All right, having said that, I asked, what are the factors that influence how much we are taking out? Okay? And I realized that there were essentially three factors. Global population, the standard of living, let's say GDP per capita. But if you multiply the global population with per capita GDP, then that's global GDP by definition, because average multiplied total is the total, okay? Total numbers is the total. And so what you're asking for is, how much of nature are you taking away, demanding, in order to produce that GDP? So you need a third factor, namely the efficiency with which you are drawing upon nature's goods to create the final products like everything around here, books, desks, and so forth. So these three factors will be influencing the demand. And the supply is, of course, nature's regenerative processes, soil regeneration, carbon recycling, and so forth. And it's the link between the two which gives rise to the problem, namely demand exceeds the supply. That paper came out in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Science. At the same time, simultaneously, several ecologists had been trying to estimate the gap between these two, by the way. They're not economists, but they didn't know I was working in this field, and I didn't know they were working on this field. And I found that their estimates were that the demand divided by supply, sustainable supply, is something like 1.7, which is another way of saying that we need 1.7 Earths to meet our current demands on a sustainable basis. But of course, 1.7 can't go on forever because Earth shrinks in its ability to produce these goods and services. So we have a problem, and a major problem. And my review of the economics of biodiversity is built on that inequality between what we take from nature and what she can supply on a sustainable basis. And the reason I concentrated on that is that, to me, and I tried to explain that in my 600-page review, is the most urgent problem humanity now faces. Most urgent problem is not how to raise GDP growth, but how do we balance our demand versus nature supply, because she is being undermined and she's kicking back at our prospects. That's what the review is about. And in a way, that's how I've tried to shape the problem that humanity faces in its dealings with the biosphere. I don't know if that makes sense, but I've tried to make it as clear as I can as to how the economic models that we use, which influences people's perception, the citizens' perception of what is possible in the economic world. These are important things. These models are not just academic interest or scientific interest. They influence, through teaching and publicity, the average person, the person who is not an economist, who is a voter, who is a citizen, her perception of what is possible. If you keep on telling her that no, science can overrun these problems, everything will be okay, we can just keep on investing and then in buildings and so forth, and GDP will continue to rise and you will have more money. If she believes you, and she will believe you, and she will then not realize that this is built on a completely rubbish model of economics, because the model doesn't take nature into account. So one thing that has happened as I've grown older now, and I guess in some sense more established, at least enough to be awarded the honor that you've given me, the Hall of Fame membership, that I can be more forceful in the way I criticize growth and development economics and the economics of poverty. I think those two big branches have let us down badly, very badly, because they've both ignored nature, even while they were talking about the poorest people on earth. I think it's a shame.